Good morning. This is Dr. Obatashaka, and once again, this is the Dr. Obatashaka Show. I hope everybody's doing fine. Before getting into today's show, I want to encourage people that have not done so, as I usually do when I start this off, to enroll in the sixfold stages to mental freedom. Primary reason for the Dr. Obatashaka Show is to introduce a way of imparting information and knowledge through the sixfold stages to mental freedom. Brother Gawa, greetings. So there's a whole method to imparting information, gaining knowledge that comes through the sixfold stages to mental freedom. And this is the signature for this show. It's the key to freeing your minds so that you can see the world through your own eyes and think for yourself. So each show has demonstrated the importance of self-knowledge, self-respect, and self-love. And so the sixfold stages to mental freedom is a path to internal peace and power over our lives, and it's been the key to what I've been able to do. Malcolm X, Amilcar Cabral, who you always see behind me, and many others have been able to do. Because if you're going to free up the space around you, and we have a topic today that addresses that, you got to be free inside. Last week, I started a new feature for this show, which is a summary of a few important news items of the day. So I'll be going through three different news items, one dealing with Ukraine, another dealing with Trump's past attempt to steal the election, another component of it, and then the opportunity that Biden has been presented with through our successful organizing that put him in the White House, which is to put a Black woman on the Supreme Court. And I think that is timely for this discussion. For those who say we have no power, this is an example clearly that we do. So right now, the Biden administration, while engaging in talks with Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, over Russia's troop buildup on the border of Ukraine, Biden has ordered 8,500 U.S. troops on high alert. And since yesterday, he has said, which is consistent with his view that he thinks there's going to be a Russian invasion. And unless he's a mind reader, I don't know how he can be sure of that. He's now saying that he's going to send these troops to Eastern Europe, where they will join NATO's rapid response team of 30 to 40,000 troops. This is hardly enough to deal with the troop buildup of Putin, and it would be foolish if the U.S. got involved. Leandra, glad to have you. Peace to you. So some of you may wonder, well, why am I dealing with Ukraine? What's that got to do with Black people? 40% of the military is made up of Black and brown people. So anything that gets done in the Ukraine is going to affect your Black butt. So you need to know. Plus, African people need to deal with the world. And this idea that we only confine ourselves to events that directly affect Black folks is ridiculous, because everything affects us, and what we do impacts the world. And today's discussion is going to be on Black Power, and this is also an expression of that. And remember when Dr. King got involved in the war in Vietnam, and before that, SNCC, and before that, um, uh, our major leader, Malcolm X, and before that, Black people who were opposed to the war in Vietnam. The common view is we're supposed to stay out of international affairs. Really? If you buy that, that is surely an example of um, mental colonialism, mental incarceration. So the fact that Biden has now said that he's going to put these 8,500 troops into Eastern Europe is telling you what he thinks. So Biden has stated that he thinks that Russia is going to invade the Ukraine. The president of the Ukraine doesn't agree with him. He doesn't think that invasion is imminent, or at least that's what he said. He knows that it's not smart to say that, even if he thinks that, because it's going to help weaken his economy and upset his people while he's preparing for an invasion, which he couldn't stop. Russia could run over him in 5 minutes. And America's not going to stop. Biden said so. That is militarily. He better not, because it's going to involve the U.S. in a serious war. So he said he's not going to do it. So why are you even deploying these 8,500 troops? And I'm going to tell you, Biden's a cold warrior. Bad as Trump was, the only good thing about him was because he was into America first, he generally avoided entanglements. Now, he was a mouthpiece for Putin in many ways, for sure. And there seems to be some pretty good speculation on why. But at the same time, not because he was a peacenik, but because he's an American first Nick, he avoided that. But Biden has been dropping some bombs almost as soon as he got in office. And understand, we put him there, but this is critical statements on him. So the reason I'm presenting this is because this affects you in more ways than you think. First, why is Putin doing this? The main reason, and your mainstream media rarely discusses this, is because since the fall of the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Bush 1, George Bush's father, had promised the head of Russia that America would not take advantage of this, would not expand NATO into their country or close to their country, and would not bring in former USSR members into NATO. And what happened when Clinton came into office is he began to ring the Soviet Union with NATO troops. And that's the main reason that Putin is making the moves that he's making, is that he wants to get that off of the USSR. I'm no supporter of Russia. I'm not an opponent. I'm not a supporter. But what would America do if Russia had 1,000 troops on America's border, let alone his military alliance? What would they do? It doesn't require any imagination to figure that one out. So, in this person's opinion, there is no justification for Russia being surrounded by NATO troops. In fact, there's no need for NATO. I'll get into that in just a minute. But the reason that you have this kind of posture is a decision made by Harry Truman after the death of Roosevelt. Had Roosevelt stayed in office, there would have been no Cold War. And all you have to do is study the history. You'll see that he would have worked out a relationship with the USSR. It's not that he loved them, but he understood that They had played a vital role in World War II. They had defeated 200 German divisions when the US, Britain, and a small number of French troops only defeated 10, 10, 200 to 10. You know what I mean? So who won World War II? So how is it that the people, and it's not that they went out to save America, they were invaded by Germany, so they fought back. But the Russians lost 27 million people. Um, they saved the West from Germany because Germany had swept all over Western Europe. The only thing it didn't have is Britain. And that was a decision that Hitler made not to wipe out British troops right away. And by the time they did, they were saved. But Britain could not have stood up against Germany. And it's American intervention, and particularly the bad decision by Hitler to invade Russia. Anyone that knows strategy knows there's a couple of places you don't go. Russia is one, Afghanistan's another, and anyone that really studied history, they'd know Vietnam is another. But since the people in power have not bothered to study the history of people of color, they get themselves involved in a quagmire and get their butts whipped. But in this particular case, Truman starts a Cold War, in part out of ignorance, because this was not a well-informed president, in part out of the advice that he accepted from people around him, Cold Warriors, to build the national security state, which means when World War II is over, American troops should have been demobilized, the draft should have been ended, and America should have used its economic power to build up its economy. It was the strongest economy in the world. Instead, they create the national security state. And what that means is a standing military, continued draft until Vietnam, towards the end of Vietnam, and a failure to put money into what this country needs: infrastructure, education, which basically is funded through homeowner taxes at the public school level, and a guaranteed annual income, healthcare. These are the kinds of things that the American government should have put their money into, but because they invested in the national security state, they put it in the military budget, which is close to 800 billion. It's high 700 billion a year. And so that's where your money goes, which means it goes into the pocket of the rich, not into the needs of the poor. So I'm no prophet. I'm not going to say what I think is going to happen in Ukraine. I don't know, though I think that Putin would be foolish to actually invade Ukraine because his economy can't stand it, and it's going to cause all kinds of problems for him in the midst of a COVID crisis. And he has his own economic problems, but I'm not trying to predict it. I'm just simply saying that this is another case of America saber rattling. And your Black Secretary of Defense is having a good time with it. The second news item is around federal prosecutors starting an investigation of Trump's attempt to overturn the last presidential election by sending fake election slates for Donald Trump to Congress. And these slates were in the areas in which blacks concentrated, were concentrated into a heavy voting bloc. These were these particular states, 7 battleground states, all of which were won by Biden. So this move, combined with January 6th, combined with a substantial number of Republicans in the House, who stood behind this lie that the election had been stolen, and other things that we're seeing come up since then are an indication that Trump was making some serious moves to try and overturn a legal election, which, as I pointed out in last week's news, and we've discussed in other ways, they're doing now through legislation coming at state level, um, where voter restrictions are being laid down to restrict the black vote in a variety of ways. This is to make it easier for the Republicans to seize the House, maybe the Senate, and definitely the presidency. So these are matters not to take lightly. And the fact that the Democrats have played around with voter registration laws is a further indication of the problem, and particularly the fact that they can't get a unified stand on this so that they can pass it. Manchin has opposed his own legislation on voter rights in favor of maintaining the filibuster. You know what I mean? So, Democrats here, particularly those handful who have held up any kind of move to address voter registration, are part of the problem. Of course, the Republicans, you don't expect to get their support. The final news item, which is appropriate for today, as I know you know, Justice Stephen G. Breyer, the 83-year-old member of the U.S. Supreme Court, announced that he'll retire. And this is giving Biden his first pick to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, this is important because today we're going to be dealing with the topic of Black Power. And this is important for us to note because Biden's only making this move because of the moves we made to save his behind in South Carolina, which was the only primary campaign he really won. After that, the Democratic Party, through their support behind him, got all other opposing candidates to step out of the race. And so the South Carolina win provided the Democratic Party establishment with the justification for supporting Biden based on the premise that he could beat Trump, which proved to be true. And then it also provided the basis for Trump picking Black Vice President, Kamala Harris. And it was interesting, a Black female vice president, because Black women played a very strong role in defeating Trump. Black people in general, but Black Lives Matter in particular, heavily led by Black women, young Black women, played a big part in that victory, along with Trump's bungling of COVID-19, which his base seemed not to care about. But a larger group of people in this country did. So at the same time, Biden made a promise that his next Supreme Court nomination, that is the one he would make if he became president, would be a Black woman. He put himself on record saying that, and that appears to be the case, that he is going to choose between a number of candidates for the Supreme Court, a Black woman. And this is an example of your power, but you always want to say you don't have any. There's two rules in war. One is don't underestimate your enemy and don't underestimate yourself. Either one of these are a mistake. You'll lose if you do either one of these. You know what I mean? So this whole notion that even King had that we don't have any power was disproved by the fact that the Southern movement produced the first defeat suffered since the Civil War when it came to post-Reconstruction and Jim Crow, through ending legal segregation and overturning the move to deny blacks the rights to vote, which they're moving back to do everything they can to restore. But they're never going to be able to fully restore it because this is a different historical period. I've gone through this before. So uh, among the Supreme Court justices that Biden has to choose from, I'll speak of three. One is a sister. Her name is Michelle Childs, a U.S. District Court judge from South Carolina. All her education comes through South Carolina, which I think is interesting and good because almost all these appointees usually come from Ivy League colleges. But that's one choice. She is on the U.S. District Court in South Carolina. The second candidate, and I'm only referring to three, there are more, is Ketanji Brown Jackson, U.S. Court of Appeals for D.C. Circuit, District of Columbia Circuit. She clerked under Breyer, and she's Breyer's candidate. Now, when you clerk, that means that you are an outstanding law student, and very few blacks get to clerk for a Supreme Court justice. So that's interesting in and of itself. And then the third of the number Biden's going to look at, the three that I'm looking at, is Leandra Krueger. She serves on the California Supreme Court, and she's a California Supreme Court judge. So Biden has one of these to pick. There's never been a black woman on the Supreme Court. And if you call Clarence Thomas black, well, you really got to narrow your definition of black, because he's not only the whitest justice on the Supreme Court. When it comes to positions, to describe him as a conservative is inaccurate. He is an extreme right winger. So it should be noted that Thurgood Marshall was appointed to the Supreme Court, the first black on the Supreme Court, by Lyndon Johnson. Thurgood Marshall is the person who successfully pleaded the case before the Supreme Court for Brown versus the Board of Education, which was the opening shot in the Black Freedom Movement, condemning segregation in the public schools. I think it's reasonable to assume that had there been no Black Freedom Movement, and of course, a person as brilliant as Thurgood Marshall, but we got a whole lot of brilliant people, there would have been no Thurgood Marshall on the Supreme Court. Your power made that difference. But you think you don't. I know some of you aren't in this position. I'm playing with you. You think you don't have any. That's like a boxer entering a ring, thinking that he doesn't have any power. He's defeated in advance. He might not throw a punch, or his punch might not be as hard. So I'm setting you up for the discussion today. Your power was sufficient in this last election that you put Trump in the doghouse and you put Biden in the White House. Now, all the sad things about Biden, it was a good thing that you put Trump out, because I'm telling you what was going to happen if Trump had come in a second term. And what will happen if he gets the House and Senate in another term? Your Social Security will be gone, A. And B, you're going to see this country move towards a form of fascism you don't want to see. It's crypto-fascism right now. You know what I mean? Elements of it. But, you're going to see some stuff that you're not going to like. So this is a case of some muscle that you got and that you need to at least recognize. I'm not endorsing any of these candidates. I'm not suggesting that whichever one gets on is going to be a radical or a revolutionary. I'm not suggesting any of that. I'm just simply saying that without double O soul, something else would be happening. Now, for today's show, Today's show um, is a part two of last week's show entitled Black Power Part One, Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, and Ghana's Independence Movement. I hope you note I do a lot of research on these shows. I don't have to. In this show particularly, I'm a part of this. I was a part of this movement. I know the inside. I'm just going to talk on the surface of what I know, But I always do more research because I think it's beneficial for you. And as I told Lao Tzu, some of you are so well read that if I just give you that, some of you are already going to know it. So I got to give you something else. But it's for me too, because each show I'm coming up with some stuff I didn't know. And that's true for this show, So there's some homework that gets done for this show. And so last week's show was carefully researched. And if you looked at it, there's going to be a lot of stuff that you didn't know, And it was entitled Black Power Part One, Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, and Ghana's Independence Movement. The essence of that show is that it demonstrated how much power Blacks wield in the diaspora, in this case, the Garvey movement, based in the United States, and then having a far-flung presence throughout the world. The Garvey movement played a major role in the success of the movement for independence in Ghana. It was a major influence on the thinking of Kwame Nkrumah, who was its principal organizer. And then this show, that last show, demonstrated the Garvey movement was a central inspiration on Ho Chi Minh. You hear me? And Ho Chi Minh's one of the best leaders of the 20th century, a man of absolute integrity who loved his people and who devoted his life to his people's liberation. It was Marcus Garvey when he said, Africa for the Africans, Asia for the Asians, and Europe for the Europeans. As I pointed out last week, Ho Chi Minh was in the audience listening to him because he was working on a steamship for the French. And he said, I have no business doing this. I need to go back and kick France out of Vietnam. And as it would turn out later, Japan and then America. One beautiful brother. But the power of Black folks, especially in this country and then globally, had an impact not only on the African independence movement, but on the one in Asia. A bad mother for you. You hear me? Ho Chi Minh. I love that. I love that man. And he was also educated in racism here. He understood the thinking of the white man. So that was last week's show. Today's show is entitled Black Power Part Two, the 60s and Black Power, Lessons for Building Black Power Today. This show is dedicated to one of the less known leaders of the Black freedom movement, one of the most brilliant minds I've ever known, a person who gave me a lot of help. He wrote the introduction to my book on the political legacy of Malcolm X. He helped me in building the organization that still operates, that was a successor of the Congress of Racial Equality, Pan-African Peoples Organization, and helped me in building 211 units of housing, the Marcus Garvey cooperatives, and did a whole lot of other things. And in his own right was a major leader in the Black arts movement. His name then was Jogan Calvis, and now is Dengani, which was the brother of my namesake, Tashaka. Dengani Jogan Calvis, beautiful brother, brilliant brother, and I'm dedicating this show to him, and in the spirit of him, to the people who helped shape me, because we come out of movements, and movements shape you and open your eyes and give you direction. And so Dengani and his beautiful daughter who looks after him, this is for you, brother. This show for you. Um, so, as I noted in the advertisement for this show is going to give you an insider's perspective as a leader in the Black Nationalist wing of C.O.R.E on how the Black freedom movement organically developed into a Black Power movement. And this is going to focus heavily on the internal developments inside this movement in both the South and the North that drove the movement to grow from a movement for reforms of the system where you put Band-Aids on the system to a movement that addressed fundamental inequities of the white power structure, and for a movement that called for fundamental change in the system, which Black Power became an expression of. So some of the stuff you're going to get here is in no books. And unless you're in the movement, you're not going to know this. And I see even Blacks who write on the movement who were not in the movement to have more of an outsider's view because they weren't in it. And then there's the assumption that things didn't really happen until Black Power. So in many cases, when people are writing on C.O.R.E, S.N.C.C, or S.C.L.C, their real focus is on Black Power, not understanding that Black Power is a fruition coming out of the Black freedom movement, A number one. And A number two, the greatest expressions of Black Power came from these movements themselves. And Black Power became an expression to summarize the views of people leading this movement and its development. And we'll get into an understanding of that. So this is really key to understand. Now, in past shows, I've noted a critique that Malcolm X made of the Black freedom movement and particularly the youth in the movement. I told you I met with with Malcolm as a part of a leadership group in 1963. A lot of us in the movement had exchanges with Malcolm, and I want to note this. The movement had a greater impact on Malcolm than he had on us, but he had a big impact on us. Why? The movement was greater. It was bigger. And I pointed this out before. One of Malcolm's older brothers in a film called Make It Plain, in which Sonia Sanchez and many others took part, his older brother, not his eldest, made this comment. Malcolm began to sound more like what he called the civil rights movement, it was actually Black freedom movement, than he did the Nation of Islam. And that was true because Malcolm respected this movement and particularly the youth in the movement. And he had a great deal of respect for King, contrary to the propaganda that he launched on behalf of the Nation of Islam. He was constantly asking King's lawyer, who helped him in a lot of things, who later became a member of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. He was constantly asking him, what did King think of him? Blah, blah. And you saw that picture of King and Malcolm in front of the House of Representatives where they both got big grins on their face. Malcolm's grin is real interesting, given the kind of attacks that he launched on King, a lot of which was pure bull. And he got jacked for it, not for his criticism of King, but for the nation's stance on the Black freedom movement while benefiting from it. San Francisco freedom movement, whole lot of Muslims in bow ties were walking down and getting those jobs we busted open. But the movement was getting criticized for things that it didn't deserve. But the point is, in real life, Malcolm was meeting with us, the young Turks in the movement, because he was looking to us for direction. As we began to draw on him for direction, the more he began to influence us. But our first teacher wasn't Malcolm, it was the battlefield. And that's where you learn your main lessons in life, is the fight. You hear me? And so that was the key thing. And Malcolm was learning from us as he was learning from the world. And then we were learning from him because he became the most advanced mind in the Black freedom, Black power movement, even though that movement itself came after his death. But Malcolm had made this critique of particularly the youth in the Black freedom movement. He made the critique that the youth had made the mistake of accepting the political analysis and political direction of their older leaders. And he was saying that we should have come up with an analysis of our own. I've discussed this before, but I'm going to give you another slant to this because there's always angles to all of this. There's truth in what Malcolm says, but fundamentally, because he's on the outside and he's seeing something, because he was a pretty good observer for someone who was on the outside of the movement. Unless you're on the inside, you're not going to have the insider's perspective, just as we're not going to have the insider's perspective on the Nation of Islam unless you're on the inside. You know what I mean? Because there's things going on the inside you're not going to know any other way. And then different people on the inside are going to have different perspectives. So in the case of S.N.C.C., this critique just couldn't apply because S.N.C.C. wasn't joining an organization made up of older leaders and then coming up under their leadership. The older person that had an influence on S.N.C.C. was Ella Baker. And as S.N.C.C. people have said, no Ella Baker, no S.N.C.C., because when she called the S.H.A.W conference at the university she had attended, Shaw University, in the midst of the sit-ins, that's where S.N.C.C. is born. And Ella Baker is then acting executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, King's organization. And there's pressure coming on her, not only from King, but from other movement people, particularly King's organization, to make the student movement subordinate to their organization. Each of these major organizations wanted the students to be a part of their organization. And Ella Baker fought to see that they maintained their independence, but the students were going to be independent anyway. And while Ella Baker had a philosophy of group-centered leadership, the students already believed in that. And so she supported that. So it was not a case, in the case of S.N.C.C., of S.N.C.C. people bowing to the analysis of older leaders, because they were the people, young people, who had created this organization. So older leaders didn't have an influence because it wasn't founded by them or led by them. Ella Baker was somebody who was always present and there to be a sounding board and encourage people to engage in dialogue and raise questions, and at crucial points, help them walk through some issues that could have divided the organization or destroyed it. So she played that kind of role. But basically, the students were running that. So it's not a case that they entered the movement taking on the analysis of elders within the organization. I'm going to still say there's a point to Malcolm's analysis, and I'll get into it in a minute. SCLC, King's organization, was born of the most successful, most defining movement of the Black freedom movement, the Montgomery bus boycott. That was the most important of all the Southern victories because 97% of Black people supported that movement for over a year and, broke the back of segregation in the area of busing. But it was the first real victory against Jim Crow. And, it wouldn't have happened but for the masses of Black people. King was a young man then, in his 20s. And when SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, is formed later, with King as its head, and then a lot of ministers who make up that group. And this, by the way, was recommended to King by Ella Baker, Stanley Levinson, and Bayard Rustin, because they were sitting on the sideline thinking ahead. So they recommended to King that he do this. And it was King's credit. King had advisors and he listened. And this was the real credit of King. Everything wasn't based on King. You know what I mean? Because I want to summarize some points with Menu Ampin. I really want to summarize some knots. King was not an organizer. King was not an administrator. King participated in a movement that did mobilizing, and he wasn't the principal mobilizer. James Bevel's was, of all King's assistants, the best when it came to mobilizing. King was the maximum spokesperson for the Black Freedom Movement. They called him, in the movement, we call him the Lord, because he had this august, dignified quality about him that comes out of Southern Black culture. You know what I mean? And also the Black church. He had dignity about him. He carried himself that way, the king, but he didn't carry himself in an arrogant way. He wasn't an arrogant person, So the point is that in the case of SCLC, it was a young organization made up of young ministers and coming out of Black culture. Say what you want about the Black church. It's got the jewels in your culture, the most African stuff in your culture. And so it wasn't a case of King and his people taking on the position of older leaders. They were the leaders. Now, Malcolm still got a point. I'm going to make his point in a minute, but I'm refining it because you got to see things from the inside. Now, in the case of C.O.R.E, we joined an organization that had been set up in the 40s through the group called the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Over time, James Farmer became head of that group. And they did have an analysis. That is, Farmer did. And he was a good man. Without Farmer, C.O.R.E would have not have become a national organization because he gave birth to the Freedom Rides. Farmer was a man of integrity. He was charismatic. Like King, he was a brilliant student. King graduated from high school at 15, and Farmer, something like that. Farmer's father was a college professor. But Farmer was a committed integrationist, philosophically and committed to nonviolence. So we did get that when we came into C.O.R.E. Those of us who were younger, we did get that, But the qualification here is that those of us who joined C.O.R.E and S.N.C.C, when it came to nonviolence, I'm ex-Marine. Many people in C.O.R.E ex-military. I don't think very many in S.N.C.C, if any, because they were all students. And I was a student too, but I was ex-military reserves, Some of us, John Handy, who was in charge of our Freedom Band, one of the greatest saxophonists in the history of jazz, sold 1 million records on Hard Work. His song Hard Work appeared at the Monterey Jazz Festival 11 times, more than any other jazz musician. Is a jazz composer, graduated from San Francisco State, where I taught there in Black Studies and in music. John Handy was a boxer. Little guy too, you know what I mean? Come out of Texas. And then Tamatra Scott, who was 20 years older than me, one of the best organizers after the San Francisco Freedom Movement of Black youth. He was a boxer and a dancer and a cab driver and saw himself as like a father figure for me and was a good advisor on women. Of course, I don't know how good it was because every sister that I looked at, he was telling me why she wasn't no good. You know what I mean? Because he was trying to protect me and considered himself a part of my security detail. But the point is, C.O.R.E people, S.N.C.C people, the majority of us, we took nonviolence as a tactic. It was no way of life for us. And we could all fight. You know what I mean? And most people in S.N.C.C, they had no military background. They didn't need one. I didn't need one either. You know what I mean? I didn't learn that much from the Marine Corps that did me any good in C.O.R.E other than to know I got an enemy and to know that that enemy can kill you and take measures. I knew that. I never underestimated what the enemy could do. But other than that, most of what I learned came out of the movement. Didn't come out of college. It came out of the movement. In fact, my PhD, my first PhD wasn't at no PhD program, which I got mine in my 50s. My PhD was the University of Fillmore. You hear me? The Harlem of the West. And it was black folks in the Fillmore that taught me. You hear me? And then Marcus Bookstore, which became my university for books. As Michelle Bookstore was the university after prison and Malcolm's reading in prison for Malcolm, where he'd fall asleep in those book stacks, stacked up to the wall that I referred to last week, Louis Michaud, and where Malcolm held his major rallies, because if you're going to be a leader, you better be a reader. And a lot of our leaders don't read, and therefore they're going to lead you into some corners. You hear me? Because you got to have something to draw from, something to think about. You got to commune with the masters that have gone before you, as well as the ones who are around you. So up to a point, Malcolm was wrong on this, but up to a point, he was right. And it is true that in the case of C.O.R.E. particularly, we had to, and S.N.C.C. and S.C.L.C., we had to go through an analysis that had been provided by elders, even though in the case of S.N.C.C. and S.C.L.C., they were young people forming their own organization. They inherited an analysis coming from the Black establishment, which is a whole nother thing to understand. It's a group created by Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois, made up of the established Black institutions in the United States, of which the civil rights groups, particularly NAACP and the Urban League, are the major leaders. And it's made up of Black universities. It's made up of major Black businesses. It's made up of major Black church leaders and so forth. And it's basically a control group. And its philosophy is integration. You know? It wants to integrate you into the mainstream of America, and that mainstream is polluted, you know, and it depends on the money of the white establishment. And as Lerone Bennett, who's provided the best analysis of the Black establishment, observed, it's militant in words and conservative in action. You know what I mean? So King would use the term integration. And as we pointed out with Menu Ampin, that wasn't serious for him because he came out of Black culture. But the point is, those of us in the Black freedom movement, the youth especially, would not be able to do what Malcolm said we should do, which was in the very beginning, come up with our own critique of our philosophy and overall objectives, because we were like privates coming into an army. And a private coming into an army is in no position to lay out strategy and tactics. You know, and in fact, may never rise above the enlisted ranks. But if they're going to rise to a general or something like that, then they're going to have to demonstrate a whole lot if they're good generals. You know what I mean? And so in the Black freedom movement, we needed time to mature and to think through our own thoughts, because we didn't come in prepared for this. Nobody does. This was a movement unexpected by us, unexpected by the white power elite, just as the African independence movements were to the colonizers there. So it would take time for us to come up with our own analysis. And it was the battlefield of Black liberation in the South and in the North that would be the great classroom. And I'm going to say this. I have a proverb that I've come up with: absence is ignorance. If you're going to know something, you need to be there, not just get somebody's version of it. And if you're absent from something, and they give you a version of it, that's their version. And it may be very accurate from their standpoint. But if you were there, you might have seen something different. And so in the case of the Black freedom movement South, which drove the freedom movement in the North, because it was the starting of it, it was where the most difficult campaigns had to be carried out because they were carried out in the face of raw, naked violence. But it was a classroom in both the South and the North that provided the lessons that would lead us to grow and would ultimately lead to what we call Black Power. Now, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, because I'm going to be looking at two wings of this. One is the Southern movement, the other is the Northern. And the Northern will be through the lens of the only successful Northern freedom movement in the North, San Francisco freedom movement. I have some things to say about other movements because they were important and they made some important contributions. And I'm not saying they didn't do anything. That's the point I made a couple of weeks ago in talking about King. There were some signature moves made by a number of Northern freedom movements. But overall, there was more of a hit and miss quality to the organizing. Whereas the Southern movement had a method and got results. And in the case of San Francisco, it was the same thing. So looking at SNCC, if we want to understand the development of Black Power, then we got to understand the trials and tribulations that the Southern freedom movement went through, in this case, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they were made up of some brilliant young people, dedicated young people. A lot of them college educated, but a lot of them coming out of the grassroots. You had a Stokely Carmichael coming out of Howard, and you had a Fannie Lou Hamer coming out of Rouville, Mississippi as a timekeeper, working on a plantation, a spiritually gifted, beautiful sister. And so, you had these different components of what made up the Black freedom movement in the South. And the key thing about SNCC is that it drew its organizational direction from grassroots Blacks. This was the key to their success in the South. And it was particularly through the contacts that Ella Baker had. Ella Baker, as I've noted before, was one of the two best organizers of the 60s, her and Malcolm X, and you can't say who was better. And her real spurs in organizing came through being director of organization for the NAACP. And she organized basically the mass base of the NAACP, which was in the South. And so she established her organizing powers there, though her philosophy and everything was shaped in other places. So she had a lot of contacts in the South. And so when Bob Moses enlists in SNCC, she sends him to Mississippi and hooks him up with a man named Amzie Moore and hooks him up with another man named E.W. Steptoe, Steptoe. We got these names, you know what I mean? Who was Amzie Moore? Amzie Moore was a World War II veteran. He owned a gas station. He had his own business, but he was a leader of the RCNL in the 50s, Regional Council of Negro Leadership. And this was a group of grassroots Blacks who assembled as many as 20,000 Black people in Mississippi in the 50s. And you ain't heard of them. A few of you may have, but most of you have not. And Amzie Moore was one of the leaders of that, as was E.W. Steptoe. So these were men who understood what the people wanted, because the leadership in the 50s in Mississippi was heavily male. In the 60s, a lot more females. But in the 50s, you were just dealing with straight up terrorism. You had no federal nothing behind you. And these were the men who were playing a major role in this. Both men were always armed. So that's one of the things to get straight. And in the case of Amzie Moore, he would never go anywhere the same route. He'd always vary his routes because he understood the nature of what he was up against, the Klan and racist whites. And if you go into his house, there are weapons all over the place. And Steptoe was always armed, but his wife insisted that he not be armed, so she'd search him before he left the house, but he always managed to smuggle a weapon out. And so these were people who Bob Moses went to for direction. And this is where your power comes from. You ask what Black power is? It's your people. That's where your power comes from. You hear me? And so, and listening to them and learning from them. And Bob Moses was SNCC's best organizer. And Bob Moses was humble, a mathematician who just died recently, led the Algebra Project, PhD in mathematics, no dummy. And the major person that Stokely Carmichael, later Kwame Ture, apprenticed under. You hear me? So he goes to Amesy Moore for direction. What should we do? He goes to Steptoe, and what do they tell him? And this was the key to the success of SNCC's organizing in the South. Voter registration. That's not their opinion. That's what the people want. They want the vote. That's the issue for them. So this was the key to the success of SNCC. It listened to the people. And these were often older people who had years of experience in organizing. And as Amesy Moore said, Bob Moses brought to the table some skills I didn't have. Those were skills around the national scene, being able to get some kind of support from the federal government. Of course, it didn't come through, but you can maneuver at that level. You know what I mean? That's what Bob Moses brought. He brought a level of sophistication. But he knew that these grassroots blacks had something he didn't have. Years of experience and take no mess. You hear me? And that was, I met Bob Moses in Tanzania in 1973 after we had come out of the Ujamaa villages where my group, Pan-African People's Organization, had worked for 3 months. I had lost 15 pounds, digging up the earth and stuff in these villages, sleeping on concrete floors. And Bob Moses had been in Tanzania for a number of years teaching. This was after the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So that was my chance to meet him. Beautiful brother. Humble, nice brother. So the youth had the sense to follow some direction coming from the older generation, and the older generation was happy to have the youth engaged and willing to come down and put their necks on the line and take the struggle to another level, and having an organization that they had formed. So this was a nice marriage. Now, Amesy Moore had to check Bob Moses out. He said, I checked him out. That's what Southern blacks do. Anybody who's an organizer does that. This was the key to the Southern movement's success. In the case of the Northern movement, in this case, the San Francisco Freedom Movement, Ella Hill Hutch, who was a woman who was a good 25 years older than me. She was my mother's best friend. She was co-founder of San Francisco C.O.R.E. She was a grassroots sister that always lived in a 2-room apartment. Even when she became the first Black woman elected to the Board of Supervisors after the San Francisco Freedom Movement. She's the one that got me involved in the movement. She's the one, along with a person that worked with her, a guy named Bob Slattery, that founded San Francisco C.O.R.E. and then laid back and let us do our thing. We planned our first strategies, and I wasn't chair then, in her little apartment. And she always stayed in a little apartment. She didn't care about money. Never gossiped about anybody. A nice person. And she's the one that told me, you need to go to a C.O.R.E. meeting. She figured I needed to. And I didn't know what C.O.R.E. was. And I've told you this before. That was my introduction. So she's the mother of the San Francisco Freedom Movement. And it wasn't a case of us having to come up with our own analysis, Ella never gave us an analysis. She was open so that we could do our own thing. She was a secretary for the International Longshoremen's Union that my father worked in, the ILWU, the most militant union in the country at that time, led by Harry Bridges, an Australian. And it was a union that had over 50% Black membership because Blacks supported the general strike carried out by the ILWU. And Harry Bridges went to Black churches and told them, if the Black community supports this strike and doesn't cross the line, you'll get jobs. And we ended up with 50% of those jobs. And that's what put a roof over our head. And it was dangerous jobs. My father told stories of sometimes he's loading a ship or unloading one, and his intuition tells him to move, and boom, had he not moved, that load would have fell on his head. I've inherited that intuition from him. You know, he always had that sense when something's going to happen. I have that same sense. And as I pointed out before, my father was bad. You hear me? A ladies' man who didn't play around. But the ladies loved him. Why? Because if you were in the presence of W.H., my father, if somebody came up messing with the sister, my father would knock them out. He'd always give them a warning. Don't do that, buddy. My father was always a warning man. I do the same thing. I'm not copying him. That's just the principle of a warrior, you know, except I'm not going to warn you about how I'm going to come at you in a battle. No, that's strategy. You don't put your strategy on the table. But my father, that was my father, you know. So Ella Baker, grassroots sister. And she was the basis for us being able to do our thing, Ella Baker. And she's acknowledged as being the first Black woman on the Board of Supervisors. When she died, now Senator Dianne Feinstein was there, who was then mayor. She got to be mayor because of Ella Hutch, who elevated her to that position on the Board of Supervisors. But it wasn't even mentioned at her funeral. And she died at 59 because she was always doing stuff for Black folks, not getting enough rest and stuff. My mother was there for that memorial. No mention that she was the mother of the San Francisco Freedom Movement. You hear me? So the point I want to make is this: Black Power was a normal development that grew out of the classroom, which was the battlefield of the Black Freedom Movement in the North and in the South against entrenched white power, both white political power, naked Ku Klux Klan power, police power, you name it. That was the classroom that matured us. And so our political consciousness grew out of these movements. I am what I am because of these movements, more than anything. 62 years of organizing, the most important organizing I did was in this movement. And I've been continuously involved for 62 years. This is a part of it right here. I'm trying to share stuff with y'all. And I hope some of you take it and do something in your community with it. And I know some of you already are. So the Southern movement's political consciousness and understanding of power, both white and Black, which is the basis for Black power, in the case of S.N.C.C. and C.O.R.E. and S.C.C., was shaped by racist Southern white power elites and the Ku Klux Klan, and in the North, through our conflict with corporate America, the ones who really run this country and run the world. Our consciousness was also shaped by the betrayals, especially in the Southern movement, by the federal government. Because in the case of S.N.C.C., they had been promised by the Kennedy administration that they'd be on their side. But the Kennedy administration really didn't want any kind of movement. Kennedy took his time doing anything on civil rights. He just began to push for a civil rights bill just before he was assassinated. And yet it was the Black vote that put him in the White House. And so to the extent that Kennedy had any support for the Southern movement, S.N.C.C. or S.C.C. or C.O.R.E., they wanted it to be through voter registration so that they could get more Blacks registered to vote to put Kennedy back in the White House, not knowing that is behind would be blown away, you know? So the Kennedy administration made promises to SNCC that they would have federal protection, and SNCC people believed them. But the fact of the matter is, when it came time to get any protection, they weren't doing anything. And in the case of the Birmingham campaign, which I'm going to go into in a minute, I'm at home and I get a call from our field secretary, Ike Reynolds, who was field secretary coming out of Louisiana. C.O.R.E and SNCC and SCLC, we organized in different parts of the South, but in some areas we organized in the same areas. And then C.O.R.E organized all over the country. These other groups were Southern groups. And so one of the areas we organized in that SNCC or SCLC didn't was Louisiana. And that's where the deacons come out of. And, you know, Louisiana was vicious. Well, Ike Reynolds was our field secretary. Field secretary is a full-time organizer working for the national organization. So he's in Birmingham. And what's he telling me? Bobby Kennedy had told King, this ain't in no book, he's going to put an IRS, Internal Revenue lawsuit on him if he didn't pull out of Birmingham. Did you see King pull out of Birmingham? And did he pull an IRS lawsuit? Because he could have, but he didn't. You know what I mean? But the point is, that was the nature of the Kennedy administration. Grin in your face and do nothing to protect your back. And yet, when you go into a lot of Black households, what do you see? Jesus, Martin Luther King, and Kennedy. Now, if you're a Christian, fine, I'm not knocking Jesus. And you definitely should have King up there. But Kennedy, what did he do for you? He grinned. He gave you some coffee. You know, I mean, that was about it. They didn't even bite you to lunch. It was coffee. You know what I mean? I don't even drink coffee. You know what I mean? And of course, he wasn't going to have Malcolm up there drinking anything. And Malcolm always liked cream in his coffee. It was funny. Banana splits for lunch. That was real funny. So if we're going to understand the growth of SNCC and its move towards Black power, we got to understand why Stokely Carmichael, later Kwame Ture, and James Forman would both say Black power was nothing new to them. It was just the term that was new. What the movement was building, they had been building this all along. And in fact, that's where the power was being built during this period. So in the case of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, their most powerful move, they made two, but in terms of movement organizing, was a Mississippi Summer Project in 1964 in Mississippi. And I want to say SNCC and C.O.R.E were the only groups that organized in Mississippi. Now, you want to talk about taking some courage to even go to Mississippi. Now I know Blacks who are watching this going to say, don't be saying that. Yeah, I'll say it. My grandmother and great-grandmother from Mississippi, and I've said this before on my show, my grandmother told me when she was a kid about Black people being buried up to their necks in Mississippi with honey on their face. The ants would eat them to death. Mississippi. You hear me? You know what Nina Simone said in her song, Mississippi GD. Huh? And people in SNCC and C.O.R.E loved her. And she was conscious. They loved her for that song too. And she performed in Mississippi. So Mississippi was a hellhole. You hear me? A hellhole. You get involved in a movement in Mississippi, the only certain thing is you're going to end up dead. You hear me? So it took courage to do a movement anywhere in the South, but especially Mississippi. So Bob Moses comes up with a project, and this is showing you how Black power was being developed and it was Black consciousness growing out of this movement. He picks Stokely Carmichael to head up the organizing for the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer or Summer Project. He came up with this idea that he wanted to bring in over 1,000 students from the North to assist SNCC and C.O.R.E, particularly SNCC, because it was their project, but C.O.R.E was a part of it, in organizing for voter registration. At this time, Blacks couldn't register to vote. So this was mock registration. But it was the nature of the campaign to bring light to the fact that Blacks were denied the vote, but also get Blacks involved in this process so that when this finally opened up, Blacks could vote. And it was also a project to have freedom schools and a whole number of other things. I have folders in here on not just that movement, but other movements. It was a group called COFO, which was the Federation of Community Organizations, of which SNCC and C.O.R.E were the major part. And so this was a big project. And it was a project that would be very dangerous for SNCC or C.O.R.E organizers. So Bob Moses, being a good organizer, he picked Stokely Carmichael, later Kwame Ture, to head up this organizing project for 1964, because he's going to be in charge of recruiting students from all over the country. Now, this shows the mathematical mind, but also the organizing genius of Bob Moses. It also shows his humility. He didn't go do this himself. He could have. He went off. He was preparing for what became the Mississippi challenge to the Democratic Party, the MFDP, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party challenge, where SNCC would challenge the seated white Democratic delegation to the Democratic Convention and push forward the position that Blacks from Mississippi should take their place. So Bob Moses was handling that. He gives this big assignment to Stokely. Now, Stokely's interesting. I want to give a little background. Stokely was a friend. I knew Stokely. Stay at my house. We put security on him. He's a ladies' man. He wanted to go out and see this woman, see that woman. We say, fine, brother. We're not restricting your freedom to socialize. We're just putting armed ass security on your butt, because if anybody touches you, they're going to the cemetery. And oh, yeah. And my people we have Simbas and Pan African People's Organization. They're trained in martial arts. They're trained in different things. You know what I mean? They're very serious. They ain't no joke. You know what I mean? So, we would talk and we would exchange. But Stokely has an interesting background. He comes from Trinidad. That's important, because the two centers of Pan-Africanism are the United States and the Caribbean, and the principal center for Pan-Africanism, or the idea of one Africa, is Trinidad. You produce C.O.R.E. James from Trinidad. Eric Williams, who wrote this great book, Capitalism and Slavery. It's a classic work on how slavery gave rise to the entire industrial system of Britain. You know what I mean? And Kwame Ture, he came to the United States as a young child. He went to one of the best high schools in New York. The guy was brilliant. And he got exposed to a lot of thought by being on the streets of New York, listening to street corner orators like Queen Mother Moore and a host of others, a lot of Garveyites. He said part of his oratorical style was shaped by listening to those street corner orators. Well, that was history, because they get them a ladder, have them a little flag. Most of the time it was red, black, and green, the Garvey flag, and he'd listen. So he was schooled there. And then he went to the best university that a Black person could go to at that time, Howard University. What was best about it? You had Toni Morrison as a teacher. Imagine. And of course, Kwame Ture had an eye for the ladies. So when you read his book, Ready for the Revolution, he's talking about how fine she was, you know what I mean? And all this stuff. But he took her class, and later she would handle some of his books at the publishing house that she was a major figure in, He had E. Franklin Fraser as a professor. You hear me? And he said he had some issues with E. Franklin Fraser on his notion that blacks lost their culture through slavery, as I do and many others. But he was a brilliant sociologist. He had Nathan Hare, who's my buddy, who was brought out from Howard to San Francisco State. And he's really the father of black studies at four-year universities. And Nathan Hare is a boxer, was. I spoke at Howard in 84 when my book on Malcolm came out. And I got to see fight films by Nathan Hare. Man, that guy could punch so fast. Boom, boom, boom. The guy's knocked out. And there's a picture of Nathan Hare when Muhammad Ali comes on campus, two boxers, and he's right behind Muhammad Ali, and Muhammad Ali is then resisting the draft. And Nathan's got a big smile on his face. So Kwame Ture had him an excellent education, and he majored in philosophy, and was such a good student, he had a full scholarship to Harvard for a PhD in philosophy and turned it down. Now that was Kwame Ture. Then Stokely Carmichael. So he was picked by Bob Moses, who he had apprenticed under, to do the recruitment for this summer project. I'm saying this because, of course, he plays a big part in what becomes the announcement of Black Power. Let me give you some background on him, why did he pick Stokely? Stokely was a composite. His skill set was a composite of skill sets that would enable him to do a complete job on this. He was somebody good with the grassroots. He could talk to everyday people. Coming out of the New York thing, he was able to deal with whites on a so-called sophisticated level. And the whites that he went to school with, a lot of them were children of Marxists, and he got exposed to Marxism. And when he's listening to street corner orators, he's drawn from Black nationalism, but then he's also reading Marx and stuff like that. And if you know the mature Kwame Ture, it's a fusion of these two, along with Garvey being a part of that. That's central. By the way, Kwame Ture's father was a Garveyite, and his father was in Ghana during Ghana's independence ceremonies and its move to gain its freedom that I talked about last week. And so his father told him about Nkrumah wearing the cap of a prisoner. And that was what he wore when he was negotiating Ghana's independence from the British, wearing African clothes, but they would have these prison caps on with something that said prison graduates. A common feature, by the way, of the independence movement in Ghana and the freedom movements that we carried out. A lot of us went to jail. You know what I mean? I went to jail 18 times. Kwame Ture, I think 27. But none of them for any movement I led. Only one person was arrested in any movement I led. I didn't put nobody in jail because I'm a strategist. You're whipped before I ever fight you. I'm not fighting you unless I can beat you. You're already done. And if I'm going to engage you and haven't figured out how to beat you, I'm not announcing anything until I figured it out. And then I only did that once, pull together a team of smart people, and we'll come up with that strategy. But my gift is strategy. Of all things that I love doing, strategy is it, baby. You hear me? I love that more than anything. And I like pretty strategy. Pretty strategy is like a pretty woman. You hear me? It's got moves and grooves. And it's like love in that it's hard to define. And when you hit somebody with a good strategy, they won't even know what hit them. When it's a good strategy, some strategy is basic. They're going to know what it is. You're doing a boycott, they're going to know that. But there's some strategy you come up with that, And the highest strategy is to win without a fight. And most of my battles have been won without a fight, but there's others that you have to fight. And even then, the next highest is when you win a fight, then after that, the opponents in that category fall because they don't want to engage in the fight. That's not the highest, because the highest you win on policy. This is a fight that then scares your opponents, and I'm talking about corporations, to fall. So this was key. So why did he pick Stokely for this project? Because he could talk to all these groups, and he brought in the Howard network. And this was a group of activists, some of whom had joined SNCC. They would help him in this organizing. The largest number of people that would be organized would come from white colleges. This was deliberate because it would draw attention to the movement. Fannie Lou Hamer made a comment, yeah, if one of them dies, it's going to really do something. It didn't mean she wanted them to die, but she meant that the federal government and generally the media, the white power structure had no value for a black life, but if some white lives are lost, well, there's going to be some concern. Fannie Lou Hamer was a humanist, and she didn't want to see anybody die. But that was an objective observation on her part and was accurate. So what was the university network that SNCC drew from? And it was Stokely, then later Kwame Ture, that organized in that network. It was a SNCC network. Ann Arbor, Michigan University, Chicago, Madison, Boston, Washington, D.C., where you had Howard University, and the Bay Area. The Bay Area base, one of the most important bases they drew for the Mississippi Summer Project, was heavily UC Berkeley. And as I pointed out before, it was San Francisco C.O.R.E that radicalized the UC Berkeley students. And particularly Mario Savio, who would be the leader of the free speech movement, was arrested at the Sheraton Palace demonstrations, where I was arrested with Dick Gregory, Nat Burbridge, who was in charge of the NAACP, one of the best NAACP heads in the country, and thousands of students were arrested. That was his initiation into the struggle, I said before in previous shows, into white manhood. He said he became a man by joining this movement. This was a brilliant UC Berkeley student. He then went to Mississippi and apprenticed under Bob Moses, and the skills he learned helped him lead the free speech movement using consensus democracy that comes out of the Black freedom movement that was practiced by the San Francisco freedom movement and, of course, by SNCC. And so this network that SNCC was drawing from was a network we had radicalized. And so as a result, they'd be prepared for that. And the bulk of those students coming from UC Berkeley didn't go in the South. They were engaged in the movement of the San Francisco Freedom Movement for a year, getting arrested all over the place. And they did good work. There's a film called Berkeley in the 60s. You should watch it. I'm in it, and I'm in there explaining how certain members of the Black establishment in San Francisco was selling the students out and what we needed to do. And we did it, and we won that battle, the Sheraton Palace Hotel against the hotel and restaurant industry. So Stokely did a masterful job of organizing these networks and meeting the goal of organizing over 1,000 students for the Mississippi Summer Project. Now, King was supportive of this campaign. And when he came to Mississippi to throw his support behind the campaign, Stokely picked him up at the airport, provided him lodging, and put armed security on him. So much for King being into nonviolence as a way of life. And by the way, it wasn't pointed out in Manu Ampun's presentation that for a while, King was receiving armed security from the Secret Service. This was during the period in which he was in Johnson's good graces. And it's when he takes a stand against the Vietnam War 24/7 that that's not only withdrawn, but other things happen. Because we went into his assassination last year, in which military operatives played a major role in that. And that could not have happened without the orders of the President of the United States. You hear me? So the earlier organizing in Mississippi by SNCC and C.O.R.E led to conflicts with the white power structure at the governor's level, at the mayor's level, at the level of the Klan and other white citizens, consuls, and other violent racist groups. And it would lead to the death of civil rights or Black freedom movement workers. But it was this movement others that preceded it, and the Mississippi Challenge, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party Challenge, that would shake the consciousness of SNCC and help develop what becomes the Black Power movement. Now, the white power structure, when they hear about the Mississippi Summer Movement, treated it like war. It was very, very serious. The Johnson administration, by just picking up a phone, could have stopped this or stripped it of any violent potential. They could have, and they did nothing. They did nothing. And so what ends up happening is, in Mississippi, they had what was called the White Sovereignty Commission. The White Sovereignty Commission was a commission put together by the governor of Mississippi, and it spied on Black groups. It carried out executions. It did all kinds of stuff that was violent or harmful to Black political, social, or economic life. And so this Sovereignty Commission starts issuing statements, and then at various levels of Mississippi power, they begin to take measures. And so these are the words coming from the Sovereignty Commission on the Mississippi Summer Project. They said, quote, thousands of degenerates and terrorists, you notice that? Capable of unimaginable evil are going to descend on a good old Mississippi. Huh? The mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, Frank Thompson, and I'm going to show you, this is war preparation. You would think that Black people are coming in here with an army to invade Mississippi. You know, these are peaceful freedom fighters. The mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. And this is what helps raise consciousness and is part of the education around how power works. White power in this case, and Black power. So the mayor, Frank Thompson of Jackson, Mississippi, that now has a Black mayor, you know, he adds 100 cops to the police force. They already had 200. He purchased 2 horses. Should have given that to the freedom movement. We could use some horses, you know, and 6 attack dogs. He bought 200 new shotguns. He couldn't even buy some used ones. And stockpiles of tear gas and tear gas masses. And you know, they weren't going to be used for us. You know, they're going to use it on us, but we ain't going to get no tear gas mass, you know. He purchased, hear this, 3 military troop carriers. What the holy hell you need with some military troop carriers is obvious. And 3 tractor-type vehicles to haul away demonstrators, you know, as though we're dirt or something. He brought in 2 1/2-ton military trucks mounted with searchlights. If you think this is way overboard, guess what? He bought a Thompson tank. You hear me? Now, this ain't funny because actually you have militarized police right now who've got a lot of this kind of equipment. You hear me? Huh. This Thompson tank, that's a tank you use in a battle against an army, had a 6.5-ton battle wagon complete with bulletproof glass, machine gun ports, 6 built-in tear gas and gun emplacements. I mean, you know, you're expecting an invasion from another country. That's how it's being treated. And of course, we aren't treated as citizens of this country anyway. And so in the minds of whites, that's how it exists, you know. So if the mayor of Jackson was going to do all this, the governor was not going to be outdone. So he called an emergency session of the legislature of Mississippi and doubled the size of the Mississippi Highway Patrol. I was arrested by the Highway Patrol in Mississippi in '65. That's a whole nother story. I'm not going to get into it in this one. So the state of Mississippi made even freedom schools a crime. And that was one of the organizing projects for the Mississippi summer. And if you passed out a single leaflet calling for a boycott, that was a crime. You know, they're trying to cut the movement off at its legs. Now, this is creating a climate of terror. This is also saying to right-wing vigilante groups, you can do what you want, or to any white groups. So Stokely, while this is happening, is organizing students in the North to recruit them for the Mississippi summer. And when a Black church is burned down in Mississippi, 3 organizers, all members of C.O.R.E, Mickey Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, who were white, and James Chaney, who was Black and from Mississippi, go back to Mississippi. They drive back from the recruitment training that Stokely was doing to investigate the burning of a church, and then they were murdered in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And this was the product of this terrorism. These were C.O.R.E members. They were part of the Black freedom movement. So I'm saying all of this to make this point that Black Power and the Black Power movement was simply an outgrowth of lessons learned and consciousness raised through the Black freedom movement struggle. It was the result in the South of the conflict between the movement and the violent racist power structure led by governors, mayors, and other politicians, and by the Klan and right-wing groups, and the federal government. In the case of J. Edgar Hoover, often operating in league with them, because he would have spies inside these groups, and they would be right up there listening to, watching what they did. You know what I mean? And not doing anything to stop it. And then you have a film like Mississippi Burning, in which the FBI, who was a part of the oppression of Blacks, is portrayed as the savior of Blacks. And when the maker of that film was asked why, they said, whites aren't ready for a Black hero. Who gives a hell what white people are ready for? You understand? Huh? So the Black freedom movement in the South learned from the classroom of the battlefield. It learned how the white power structure was organized. It learned how the Klan operated, which you didn't really need to have this movement to know, but you got to see it close up, and how you could take measures to deal with that. And so this was a part of the reappraisal that my generation was going through battle. And note 63, 64, these dates are very important. Now transfer this to the Northern movement. In this case, the only successful Northern one, the San Francisco Freedom Movement. Our political consciousness was transformed through political awakening brought about through tangling with the economic power structure. Ours was a different environment. The issues were similar, but also different. We weren't struggling for the right to vote. You already had the right to vote. We weren't struggling to get segregation laws off the book. You had de facto segregation, but that wasn't the issue we were interested in fighting on. We were fighting on the signature issue of jobs, and then also economic empowerment. That was our signature issue because, as I pointed out in previous shows, when we went to our people, and that's why we were successful, we asked the people. We didn't come up with our version of what the people wanted. They all said jobs, 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 jobs. Nothing else. I sent people into barbershops, beauty parlors, pool halls, alcoholics, I don't care who, churches, social clubs. You understand? And we had one question. You didn't have to take no notes either. You know what I mean? Just one answer. What's the answer? Jobs. Then this is the only time I did any dictation, because in C.O.R.E, things were decided on consensus. Committees made decisions on what your actions were. I just convened the membership and got them to engage in a discussion, and we didn't do anything until everybody agreed. That's African consensus. I didn't point out before, I didn't know that was African. I just knew that was the best way to minimize your mistakes, you know? And we didn't make mistakes strategically. It's normal to make mistakes. We didn't, because we had that covered. We did not vote on strategy. You don't vote on strategy. You hear me? It's kind of like you voting on what a boxer should do when they're in the ring. Your trainer might be giving you some information, but even then, when you mature like Muhammad Ali and you're in the ring with Foreman, who's got a punch like a tree trunk, you've done one thing that is surprising to Foreman. You stood up. You stood up. Because when he got Frazier, it was like a dish rag. And Frazier was the fiercest opponent that Muhammad Ali ever faced. So Muhammad Ali had to disregard even his trainer's advice on this one, rope-a-dope, he came up with. That came from experience. Because he figured the only way he gonna beat somebody with this kind of power is wear him out. And he took some blows, but he could handle it. However, it probably contributed to what became his problems later, though I think the Frazier fights did more of that, So the Northern Freedom Movement, in this case, the San Francisco Freedom Movement's classroom was largely corporate-based. The major enemy we faced were the people that run the world, the most powerful corporations on the planet. And to beat them, it takes a whole lot of stuff. Amilcar Cabral, who, you always see behind me with the sunglasses, the greatest leader, organizer, political thinker, military strategist of the 20th century. There are a lot of people who disagree with this, but there are many more who agree. Most of them who disagree ain't going to be Black, or they certainly ain't going to be revolutionary. Cabral made this statement. He said, a people's greatest enemy isn't that enemy you face on the outside. It's not the Klan in the South, the corporations in the North, political leaders that you're facing, the police, the FBI, the CIA. Your biggest enemy are your own weaknesses. That's key. And if you do a survey of the Black Liberation Movement, you'll see that those that got defeated, the biggest reason for it was the errors made by leadership. Yes, the system came down on them and hit them hard, but if you've got good leadership, you avoid as many of those hits as possible. And you put yourself in a position, where as few of your people get hurt or none of them do. Cabral lost only a few thousand of his soldiers and inflicted over 50,000 deaths on the Portuguese and probably many more on their flunkies because they had Africans fighting for them and they never counted their deaths, So Cabral observed that, but he was also working on his weaknesses, the biggest of which was his assimilated mindset that he had overcome. We all have weaknesses, and your enemy's going to come at you through your weaknesses. And sometimes your greatest strength can also be the seat of your weakness. So when Malcolm said that the Black youth had made a mistake because they had entered the movement without critiquing the older leadership, the truth is, those of us who entered the movement as youth, that was C.O.R.E and S.N.C.C and SCLC, we entered the movement as foot soldiers. We weren't leading anything. We weren't in any position to lead anything. We weren't in any position to critique what our leaders had come up with before. And so it would take time for us to come up with our own critique. And 1963 represents the turning point in the movement, generally for its maturing and also for our ability to begin to critique where the movement had been, but where it needed to go in the course of battle, because we needed enough experience to be able to do that. And you do it much better if you're leading a successful movement. You're not getting beat into the ground. And that was why King's conclusions were so valuable. He led a successful movement. And he came up with big, correct ideas about system needs to be restructured. I think that there were some other ways he could have handled that restructuring. Maybe might have kept him around a little bit longer, but maybe not, you know. But the key point is, he came out of successful movement. Successful movements are going to generate more successful ideas than ones that get beat into the ground. Though losing can teach you how to win. So if you get knocked down, you have to pick yourself up. As the Chinese say, a fall in the pit leads to motherwit. Or it should. Some of us keep doing the same old dumb stuff. Like those of you who haven't had a shot lately or ever. And some of whom are in hospitals on respirators. And when you get on a respirator, you usually don't come off. And if you're smart, you say, I wish I took a shot. But some of those will go down talking about, it wasn't COVID that did this to me, blah, blah. Well, everybody that's dying right now ain't got a shot, buddy. You know what I mean? I know that's a sensitive subject for some people. It's too bad that common sense ain't so common anymore for some of us. You know what I mean? So 1963 represented an internal and external turning point for the Black freedom movement, North and South. And unless you're in the movement, you wouldn't know it. SNCC, C.O.R.E, and SCLC would reach maturity by this time, and so would Brother Malcolm X, because if you look at his radicalization, it's in 63 that he's suspended from the nation and then finally expelled. In part because he's moving in a political direction, the nation's spiritual, in part because he's not corrupt and serves as a threat to some officials who were, in part because he had become extremely radicalized on his own. He was a revolutionary in the nation, outside the nation. For King's transformation and his movement's transformation, their culmination point is 1963, where King launches his best organized campaign in Birmingham, Alabama. And it's the result of lessons learned from defeat in Albany, Georgia. And so it's his best planned, best organized campaign, and it produces civil rights legislation. His campaign was called Operation Confrontation for a reason. It was a confrontation with the entire white power structure of Birmingham. Sat him down at the table and was delivering kind of ultimatums to him, and then unleashed all these students, young people. Bevells was the one that pulled that off, James Bevells. So one of the consequences of the Birmingham movement, aside from its victory around civil rights legislation, was that a new term gets introduced into the vocabulary of the movement period, and that is power structure, white power structure. You might say, oh, that ain't nothing. Well, you never can transpose yourself from your consciousness now to a time previous to now, because previously, the white power structure could usually hide behind the fact that there ain't no power structure. People rule here, blah, blah. You know what I mean? And so the introduction of that into the vocabulary of the movement and the country was very important. Now, 1963 was a year that SNCC, with C.O.R.E's Mississippi staff support, initiates their COFO Mississippi Summer Project, their biggest organizing project. For me, 1963 was the year that I assumed chairmanship of San Francisco C.O.R.E. I was elected at the end of 62, Will Ussery, who had been a great chair, decided to step down. And I threw my hat in the ring and was elected chair. January 1963 was the date when I completed 6 years in the United States Marine Corps, trained in mountain leadership training, desert training, amphibious landing. I was a machine gunner, blah, blah, blah. I'm a soldier. I was just then in the wrong army. And by 63, even by 60, I got in the right army. By 63, I was becoming fully conscious of where I belong. But being out of the Marine Corps, it did two things for me. It meant that I didn't have to go through any kind of training on weekends. It freed that up. It meant that I could put full time into the movement, though I was also still going to law school. But 1963 is the year that I come face to face with my own internal weaknesses. And this is what we call saving grace. If you learn from your weaknesses, because had I not undergone this experience, my life would have gone in a different direction. Because here we are taking on the biggest corporations on the planet. And, we got some good things going for it. And as I've explained before, and I'll repeat it, I'm having lunch at Virginia's restaurant, which was the best restaurant in the Fillmore, run by a sister from Louisiana named Virginia. She gave us 2 free meals a day for years, because we were full-time organizers. We didn't have a cent to pay the rent. And so we get to have those good meals. And so I'm getting ready to chop into some chicken and macaroni and cheese and other soul food. Norman Brown, who's my vice chair from the first all-Black city organized by Black people, didn't see a white person until he was 18 years of age, whereas I was around white people all the damn time after, 7 years of age, being born in the Fillmore and Bernal Heights, and nothing but white people. You know what I mean? So we're sitting down and I'm getting ready to chop into some good food. And suddenly I lost my appetite because Norman starts to explain to me who runs the country. I've said this before, but I'm making this point because you need to understand how this connects to power, how it connects to understanding how power operates, both black and white, brown, red, and yellow. You hear me? And here I am, a government major in law school, supposed to be smart. My favorite expression is, I know, up till 30. Then I realized there's more I didn't know. You know what I mean? I know. That was my favorite expression, And so when he's telling me how the country is run, for you now, that's obvious. I pointed this out before. A lot of people at least know that now, but then a lot of people didn't. This is the key point to get. And that's part of why King said they had trouble building power, because you got to know how power is built against you, as well as how you build power for yourself. And King underestimated his own power because they actually did build some power, but they needed to build more, especially in the northern urban environment. So my father had already told me this stuff. He had refused to fight in World War II. He wouldn't have joined no reserves or anything else. But I didn't get his message. It was over my head. But when Norman gives me this message, I'm open now because I'm going through experiences that he's explaining. And he's given me an explanation for it. And it was a light moment, a Seba moment. It was a moment where I started to think for myself politically for the first time in my life. And this was a oh shit moment. Because when he's telling me this, I'm saying, yeah, I know. And I'm saying, oh shit. We're wrangling with the biggest corporations. I met with the governor of California, Pat Brown, who was the father of the previous Governor Brown. And he's explaining his role in protecting the state against racism. I'm meeting with him, with James Farmer. I'm negotiating with corporations, and then we're unleashing fire on them, and we're winning. But the fact is, I realize that what Norman's telling me is contrary to everything I had been taught. This is a democracy. We had entered the movement as youth, as people who were fighting so our people could get their rights, their full rights, particularly in the South. But it was based on the assumption this is a democracy. This ain't no democracy. It's a republic. And republics, you elect people, but it's the people who pay to get them elected who run them. You understand? And so I could get the message because it fit what I was experiencing. I was experiencing corporations pulling strings and the politicians jumped. Corporations writing something and the press ran it like it was God. You understand? I was experiencing all of this. So Norman was giving me a framework for understanding this. And brother, this grassroots brother, you hear me? Huh? Who thinks for himself. Still one of the smartest people I know. When I have a problem I can't solve, I call up Norman. Hey, Norman. Norman's 2 years older than me. Hey, Norman. Usually to get some help on something. You know what I mean? So the thing is, this awakening taught me two things. One, I didn't know my enemy. And two, that meant I didn't know myself. And I knew that if I didn't get sharp on both of these two things, I don't care how many victories we had, we're going into the ground. We're going to get our butts kicked. But more important, even if we win, I'm not going to know what I'm doing if we win. It could be a lucky punch, like Leon Spinks hitting Muhammad Ali. He was lucky because Muhammad Ali hadn't trained for the fight. You know what I mean? So yeah, sometimes you can win, and yeah, that ain't proof of too much. How many times do you win? And so I knew that at this point, I had to do two things. While engaged in struggle, I had to study my enemy and study myself, which is my people's history. The first book I read, and I've referred to it before, and I have it in my library, Lost Cities of Africa by Basil Davidson. And that was a general history of Africa. It wasn't, I didn't pick it because I knew it was the best book. It was the first book on history I got. A good book, you know? But why is it important when you're undergoing transformation? And this is 6-fold stages to mental freedom. And this is a mistake that a lot of people on the left or who are radical make. So they'll study capitalism. What's wrong with that? They'll study the political system. What's wrong with that? You know what I mean? They'll study what's wrong with it, you know? And Marx has a pretty good critique of capitalism. I hadn't read him then, and I have since, but I don't really need him to really understand capitalism. And it's a vicious system. It's no good. Your enslavement was the basis for its wealth and the extermination of Native Americans and ripping off half of Mexico. You hear me? But it's only when you study your history combined with theirs that you really have direction, because it's your history, your politics, your philosophy, your social structure, your economic system that provides the alternative to this one. It doesn't mean you'll go back to the way you did it then, but you'll have some ground rules for an alternative to it. And so as I'm reconstructing my mind, the key thing I'm reconstructing is fully thinking for myself. And I'm constructing a game plan that's long-term and short-term. I think 200-300 years ahead. You read my book, The Mother Principle, that's now, because everything I do is now. I'm a systems person, I explained before. These are replacement systems. So twin lineal families, which is our family model, is a replacement system for patriarchy. It's your system. I didn't invent this. I discovered it. It's a big breakthrough. And I called it twin lineal. That's my term. But God gave me the formula. And so the thing is, when you understand a system that's your own, that there's a very foundation for justice, the very foundation for loving relationships, then you have the alternative to the oppressive system, because all systems in the West ultimately arise from their oppressive family systems. And so, you know, the so-called revolutions in Asia, the Chinese Revolution, the revolution so-called in Russia, they never questioned family structure, you know. And so what you end up with is, particularly in the case of the Russian one, more oppression coming from your so-called liberators than existed under the oppressive czars, because you didn't question it. So the point is, this realization of weakness was really the transformation for me, and different people had their own experiences. So each person who's gone through this has to describe their own. What is it that affected them? How did they grow? This was my growth curve. And as a result of that, it enabled me to also last the long haul, 60 plus years, you know, because I have a long view and a short view. I live in the moment, but at the same time, preparing for the future. And that's also where your enemy is weak. He doesn't have the long view. You hear me? And that's where he's weak. He's always looking at the short term, what he can get right now. And that's also how you beat him. That's how he's getting beat in the world right now. Corporate power, political power, everything else. The Chinese are beating him because they've got a long view. And when you restore your own sense of who you are, you'll have a long view. And that'll take you out of the stress zone. Of course, kicking your enemies behind politically, socially, economically, that will relieve stress. Please believe me. Huh? So this awakening was like key to transformation and key to building enduring power and having a vision of how we needed to move. At the same time that I began to dig into the history and study the enemy, the best study, of course, was the battles we were having. And of course, the best lessons are the consequences of your victories. Because when you see the consequences, you see your power, how your power works. But if you haven't had any victories, or you don't identify with the victories you have, then you may not see that. Then you put yourself into this, oh, we're powerless. We don't have any power. You know what I mean? Everybody's got power. A dog has power. It's in their teeth. Your ultimate power starts with your position. You're here. That's a real powerful thing. And the numbers we are, 50 million, 60, I don't know. They say it's 40, but it's more than that. You know what I mean? You're strategically located here. That's the locus of your power. And when you understand it, you know how to wield it. So the San Francisco freedom movement was key in all of this. And this transformational process is a lifelong process. Now, in 63, something else happened. This ties into the last show. A book is published. And this book is by a white author. His name is David Cronin. He wrote a book called Black Moses, The Story of Marcus Garvey. It's not a very good book now. I mean, at the time, I thought it was great, but since I've, absorbed Garveyism, I realized that it, in terms of his conclusions, it wasn't the most advanced. But for people like me who hadn't heard about Garvey, it was a revelation. Now, someone like C.O.R.E, he had heard about Garvey before, coming from his father, coming from living in New York. The Nation of Islam was built in part on Garvey because Elijah Muhammad was a corporal in the Garvey movement. Malcolm's mother and father were both leaders in the Garvey movement. Malcolm's mother writing for its newspaper. And she gave a hiding place for Garvey when he was on the run, when he was under indictment by the FBI. And one of her cousins was a security person for Garvey. You understand? The Honorable Louis Farrakhan, the same thing. His family coming from Jamaica, Garveyites, you know. But a lot of us hadn't heard of Garvey because Black nationalism had been written out of the textbooks. And Garvey was the biggest and most successful Black nationalist of all. And so for me, as I'm studying African and African American history, Garvey becomes a major subject of study. I talked last week about what I paid for his books, Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey. And so what is it that I got out of the Garvey movement? The Black freedom movement in the North, we knew how to do economic attacks against the power structure. You know, we knew how to take them down to the knees. We knew how to build a mass movement and that kind of stuff. But one of the things we didn't know was how to build institutions. And when you study white power, you'll see that that power is institutional. It's basically corporate. And corporate institutions run the world. And in fact, corporations have made most nations obsolete on the planet. There are only a few that are really able to stand up. China, the United States. India is large, but it has not solved its overall problems. And Europe, whatever it can do, they're doing it by banding together, but they have stresses and strains, as you've seen with Brexit, because the Germans are running things, because they have the efficient economy. So the very people that lost World War II have won the political war because they have the viable economy, and money is honey for them. You understand? And their corporations are most efficient. And they didn't make the mistake of wholly exporting their economy to China, which most of the West and the United States has done, which I'm going to get into when I wrap up on this thing. So this Black power wasn't new. It was being born out of movements, especially the successful ones. So in the case of Garvey, when I take on Garvey's example, there are a couple of things, there are a number of things that are important in terms of guiding me, because he becomes the first master I apprentice under. This is under the book I'm writing now on Seba. If you really want to get to a level of mastery of your stuff, I've just finished doing Theophilo Obenga, Dr. Theophilo Obenga's work with Sheikh Diop at what's called the improvisational level in our culture, and it's called Boloso in the Dogon level, which means synthesis, where you're bringing together a lot of different skills until they flow, and then you come up with something original of your own. And that's because he was apprenticing under the greatest master on African history, particularly Kemetic history, the master Sheikh Anta Diop. And it gave him his life mission. He's been dedicated to that ever since. So Garvey became my first master, who I indirectly apprenticed under. Indirect apprenticeship is where you're learning from a master, but they're not around you. They can either be somewhere else and you can't see them, but you read their writings, or if you're a musician, you listen to their music or whatever, or they can be dead. Garvey died in 1940. I was born in 1939, so obviously there was no direct apprenticeship there. But what I learned from Garvey was how to build institutions. And my family, my mother particularly, and my brother, good at economic development. I have that skill. And the nationalists are generally not good at economic development. That's a real shame. And so I got to polish my economic development skills through Garvey, and also embrace the idea of nationhood. So when I'm studying ancient African history, I'm applying it to an understanding that we're a nation within a nation in this country. At one time, I was a pure Garveyite. I believe we're going to go back to Africa. Some of you still do. Our people aren't. I'm not going anywhere where the majority of our people are not going. I'm here to work for my people's liberation. And so I can do the best, and you can do the best to aid Africa by using your power here. But if you choose to go, that's your right too. Enjoy yourself. Of course, you're not going to enjoy yourself, because wherever you go, African people are oppressed. If you think you're going to get away from oppression, no, that ain't what's happening. So either place, you're going to have to roll up your sleeve And you know this reality best. You're best suited for this, but it's your choice. I'm not knocking anybody who goes to Africa. That was once my view, you know. So Garvey plays a big part in learning how to build power, because wasn't he powerful? But we don't have any power. I'm gonna keep joking with you on that one. So by 1964, I become the leader of the Black Nationalist wing of National C.O.R.E. And if you read a book called C.O.R.E. by Mir and Rudick, in which they didn't interview me and wrote our movement off as nothing, he does acknowledge that I led the Black Nationalist wing. And what happens with that is that by 65, San Francisco C.O.R.E. had completed its battles on many different levels. We still had some things to do around block organizing and some other economic development stuff that wasn't done under C.O.R.E., particularly the economic development stuff. But we had basically succeeded in that movement, same time that the Southern movement succeeds, but not for the same reasons. And so in 1965, I go to the National C.O.R.E. Convention in Durham, North Carolina, with Brother Dengani, who I dedicated this show to. And he also helped me in building Pan-African People's Organization and also the housing unit called King Garvey. And so we go there with a purpose. And the purpose is basically to restructure C.O.R.E. based on the lessons we had learned in the San Francisco Freedom Movement and based on lessons learned by regional field secretaries and local C.O.R.E. chapters. So they elected me chair of the resolutions committee. And I'm not going into what we came up with except for one that came out of this, but it was 33 resolutions. 32 were unanimously adopted. The one that wasn't was on voting whites out of C.O.R.E. because we felt that C.O.R.E. had reached a point. At San Francisco C.O.R.E., 90% of our members were Black, but we felt it was time for them to go into the white community and organize. But the major, so 32 of the 33 resolutions were adopted unanimously. Never happened in a convention before. And the one I'll discuss here briefly is, and this was partially the Garvey legacy, because one of the things I got from Garvey was the importance of economic self-reliance. In other words, build an organization that you finance. And one of the problems with all the Black Freedom Movement organizations is at the national level, they depended on corporate financing, labor union financing, liberal Democratic Party financing. That's called the white power elite. And so at the national level, the national office could sometimes come under pressure for that. SNCC received less money than C.O.R.E., less money than the NAACP. And as James Foreman said, they never bowed to any pressure, and I know that's true. But the fact of the matter is, one of the weaknesses of the movement is it wasn't financing its own thing. At the local level, we didn't have any money. John Handy had a freedom band. He raised money, but he couldn't raise much. And we were usually going from month to month trying to figure out how we're going to pay our rent. And the lesson of this is you can build a movement without hardly any money, though it would be good to have some, you know? So that was one of the 32 resolutions that got passed, that the financing for C.O.R.E. would have to come from the Black community. I would later do that at the local level. I'm saying that to say this, that's Black power when you implement that. And so by 65, we had done what Malcolm said we should have done earlier. We had figured out what needed to be done. So it was a series of restructuring motions, not a slogan, but restructuring motions for National C.O.R.E. And I was elected National Treasurer of C.O.R.E., the third highest ranking office in C.O.R.E., and then did a tour of the Southern projects in Mississippi, South Carolina, Florida, and a few other areas in the South. Louisiana, Bogalusa, Louisiana. Now, in 1966, Stokely Carmichael was elected chair of SNCC. And not long after that, and this is where the Black Power thing comes up as an official thing, James Meredith, who had been the first Black person to be admitted in the University of Mississippi, decided to have a march all by himself against fear. And he was shot in the back. He was fortunate that this was birdshot, not fully loaded shotgun, because he would have been dead. Birdshot will put a little hurt on you, but it's not going to do a lot of harm to you. I'm in Washington, D.C. at this time, lobbying the Senate for low and moderate income housing for the King Garvey project, staying with some lady in Washington, D.C. And I'm watching this and I'm saying, because now all of a sudden King, McKissick, who I put in office, I led the Black Nationalist wing. And when Farmer announced that he was going to step down, I led the group within C.O.R.E that put McKissick in. And so McKissick, King, Stokely, and then Wilkins and the head of the Urban League all descend on Mississippi. And I'm telling this lady I'm staying with, this makes no sense. James Meredith doing a lonely march against fear. What is that about? Black people have been fighting in Mississippi for the longest and for the last 5 years, and fear was the least of our problems. And what's the point of a march that don't have any objectives? And what can one person do? But he was a loner, he was, you know? And that was also Stokely's response. Stokely said the same thing. He said, man, this didn't make any sense. He didn't make this public. It's in his own biography, you know? Ready for the revolution. By the way, I saw him maybe a month or two before he passed at the art studio. Danny Glover's wife got to go up and say a few things to him. And if you saw the show that I did on Return to the African Mother Principle, Male and Female Equality, it's a picture of me and him together. And he had come to hear me speak in 1995 in Memphis, Tennessee. And that was nice of him to do. He was in Memphis to speak at a college the following night. And you'll see me in the film. If you watch that film, you'll see me giving him a copy of the Mother Principle, you know. So that was an honor for me that he showed up. So at first, Stokely thinks, well, this march don't make no sense. But then he realizes that this occurs in Mississippi, and the area in which Meredith was marching was a base area for S.N.C.C. And it was close to the area in which C.O.R.E organized. And he realized that if a march is going to go through those areas, that people from S.N.C.C, grassroots people, are going to wonder, why wasn't S.N.C.C there? So he flies to Atlanta and meet with his Central Committee, because he operated on group decisions, and recommended that they be involved in the march. And they were. Stokely realizes that the march doesn't have any direction. So he comes up with the strategy that King adopts and McKissick. And it was a strategy of voter registration, that they would use this march to register voters in the march route throughout that area of Mississippi. And then he plotted his strategy, and he figured out who would support this. He knew that McKissick would. He said that McKissick had been the first Black graduate of a white law school, that he was a Southern brother. And he said, and this shows how S.N.C.C was watching us. He said, a radical wing within C.O.R.E had put him in office. Yeah, I led that radical wing, you know. So he figured that McKissick would support him. And then he said he thought he might have some problems with Roy Wilkins and the head of the Urban League. And he sure enough did. And then he plotted that, well, King would come to his side, and King did. Even came to his side because one of the issues on the march was whether or not the deacons could be involved in the march. And the deacons was the Armed Self-Defense Group for C.O.R.E. And the deacons had been one of the first ones to come down to show merited support. In fact, Chilly Willie, our West Coast representative, was one of the key deacons there. And Stokely made the comment, these brothers are disciplined. They're well organized. And yeah, we should have them. But of course, Wilkins was opposed to that. And the head of the Urban League was opposed to that. But King sided with it. So again, for those who say he was just into nonviolence, King knew you marching through Mississippi. The most likely people to shoot you ain't going to be the Klan. It's going to be the State Highway Patrol. It's going to be the local police and then the Klan or anybody else white. So note, up to this point, they're taking over a march against fear, which Meredith would later join because that buckshot wasn't as serious as people thought. But there's no mention of Black Power. And so I'm still saying, this don't make sense. What is this about? Other than it did make sense to register voters, but a lot of other ways to register voters. So Kwame told me, and I told you this last week, Stokely told me the story of when he says Black Power on this march, and he tells me that, well, what had happened is Willie Ricks had come up and whispered, say Black Power. That's what actually happened on his side. And he said, Willie kind of crazy. I don't know if I should say that, but I said it. I'm quoting him. But here's what happened. And I guess he found out about this later because this is the strength and weakness of a lot of things we do. We improvise, and that's good. But if improvisation requires two things, improvisation and order, discipline and freedom. So this was kind of done on the spur of the moment, and this would be its strength and its weakness. So this is from James Foreman's book, The Making of Black Revolutionaries, a personal account by James Foreman. James Foreman had been executive director of SNCC. He was an older member, a few years older than the younger SNCC members. He kept the organization together administratively. He had just stepped down from leadership before this Black Power march so that other younger people could take over. And this is where, in that meeting, Stokely replaces John Lewis, which, by the way, James Foreman said had become conservative. And John Lewis never forgave them for voting him out. So this is how Black Power gets introduced. And this is where I got rewarded because I didn't know this until I did this research. So this is chapter 55, page 456 and 457. And James Foreman is giving an account of a guy named Willie Ricks, who comes into his office in Atlanta, who had been asked by Stokely to come and join him in the March Against Fear. So he comes in, and this is what he says. He says, quote, "Hey, Jim, I got an idea. I want to know what you think of it." And then Foreman says, "It was Willie Ricks, the young SNCC field secretary, who had acquired a reputation as a brilliant organizer of young people in Birmingham, Americas, and other hot spots in the South. This is one of the young unsung heroes, people that most people don't know about, but some do, who Stokely called on because he knew he could use his skills in this march, but he didn't know what he was going to be bringing. So Foreman goes on to say he had stopped in the Atlanta office on his way to Mississippi. The Meredith March on June 1966 was underway, and Stokely had asked Ricks to come over, which shows Stokely's organizing ability. He knew he was somebody that would be good for this march. And then he asked Foreman, and this is again the SNCC approach. They're usually either it's going to be a group decision, or they're going to consult somebody, not just go off on their own. And by the way, I pointed out before, Willie Ricks had attended the conference at Howard University held by Adam Clayton Powell, not long before this, on Black Power. That's where he got the term. And I also pointed out to you something that nobody knows, that a friend of mine named Powell had met with Malcolm X in Africa in 1964, and Malcolm told him and Adam Clayton Powell were going to organize a Black Power conference. Nobody knows. I forgot to tell Stokely, Kwame Ture, this. So this is the question that Willie Ricks asked James Foreman. Quote, suppose when I get over there to Mississippi and I'm speaking, I start hollering for Black Power. What do you think of that? Ricks asked, would you back me up? You think it would scare people in SNCC? Suppose, and Black Power, and this is Foreman's response, Black Power, sure, try it. I told him, why not? After all, you only been shortening the phrase, we're always using power for poor Black people. Black Power is a shorter and means the same thing. Go on, try it. This isn't some slightly older guy saying, oh, no, don't do it. And it is how the cry for Black Power came to be voiced. And he goes on to say, Willie Ricks, whom the world at large has barely noticed so far, must rank as one of those unknown heroes who captured the mood of history in calling for Black Power. He caught the essence of the spirit moving Black people in the United States and around the world, who were poor, Black, and without power. So Stokely is put in jail on the march, and everyone was angry because he was arrested literally for nothing. And so King had spoken, McKissick had spoken, and Willie Ricks had spoken. And so what happens then is when Stokely gets up to speak, Willie Ricks whispers in his ear. He says, it's the right time to say Black Power. And Stokely gave an impassioned speech. He was angry, and the crowd was angry. And he said things like, this is the last time I will be arrested. He'd been arrested 28 times. You know what I mean? And I'm tired of this. And he started calling Black Power. And then Willie Ricks jumps up on the platform and starts to lead the chant, Black Power, Black Power. And Stokely says, yeah, man, that man was really good at psychologically analyzing a crowd and getting them to do what, needed to be done. And so this is how Black Power was launched. It was launched spontaneously without previous planning. Now, this is the problem with Black Power. Black Power was a slogan. It was never adequately defined. Stokely would write a book on Black Power, co-authored, and would give a lot of ideas. But publicly, it was never really consistently defined. So this was a weakness of it. But it was a result of a spur of the moment decision to use that slogan. But the meaning behind it had years of development, not only in the Black freedom movement, North and South, but in our history. You can go back to Garvey, you can go back before the slave revolts, you can go back, and then if you want to do ancient history, you're talking a whole nother thing of real power. So that was a weakness. But the strength is it summarized where our people were at that time. It represented the maturity of thought coming out of the Black freedom movement that would be defined as Black Power. It put Black people in a position where they felt empowered to organize Black organizations. So you have the Association of Black Psychologists, the Association of Black Social Workers, the Association of Black Policemen, Black Studies. You understand? This was also the product of us coming to the stage of Black identity. The Nation of Islam contributed to that. Elijah wasn't so much into Africa, but was into Black. But it was basically a transformation of culture, of consciousness that King called in the South the new Negro that becomes the Black person with a natural and all of this. So while Black power didn't get defined in the articulation of it, and one of the big mistakes was that as Stokely began to move around the country, because even during the Black Power March, he was taking time off to go and deliver some speeches because people were in demand for this. And pretty soon he was all over the place speaking. And one of the real errors of SNCC was not to use this in a concrete way to organize and expand SNCC from the South to the North. Now, part of the reason is their funding was drying up because as they took a stand on Black power and at the same time a stand against the war in Vietnam, their white money was disappearing and they had not gone and built an alternative Black fundraising and economic development network, which they wanted to do. And James Foreman had commented on the on the fact that he wanted to do it, but he was involved in having to pay staff on a regular basis, so he didn't have time to set that network up. And it would have been hard to set up, but he could have. So when you're looking at Black power, Kwame Ture, then Stokely Carmichael, becomes a major figure, major leader, around which SNCC could have expanded its base. And even though they had plans to do it in places like Philadelphia, and they faced immediate attack from the power structure in Philadelphia in the midst of Black power because they didn't want them to settle down and build a base in the North, that was a weakness. But the strength was that it gave Blacks a sense of empowerment to organize, and it was a reflection of our stage of consciousness at that time. One thing that's interesting as a side note to note is that Stokely, later Kwame Ture, at that time Stokely, met with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, as did Martin Luther King. And Elijah liked him. And they had dinner, and Elijah said, "Oh, these civil rights workers must really be starved because they ate so much." And then Elijah issued orders that the fruit of Islam was to protect him. And then Kwame Ture, then Stokely Carmichael, hooked up with Muhammad Ali, who was in the Nation at that point, and would soon take an anti-war stance and become close to him as he became close to C.O.R.E, by the way, Muhammad Ali, and became extremely close to Minister Louis Farrakhan. When we were organizing the National Black United Front, him and Minister Louis Farrakhan were very close and consulted each other in terms of their moves and stuff like that. That alarmed the FBI because they're wondering what kind of relationship is being built there. And I should point out, the Nation of Islam was the only group at that time that organized crime feared. When they started to put a tax on the messengers' businesses, he called the head of the mafia to his mansion and issued orders. Don't touch any of our businesses and leave us alone. And they didn't touch them. Why? Because in prison, the only people the mafia feared was the Nation of Islam. Why? A lot of them had been thugs, some of them killers, but now they were dedicated religious followers. And there are two things that there's three things organized crime can't deal with. One is a nationalist movement. The other one is a religious movement. And the third one is the state. If the state decides to shut down organized crime, it's all over. The reason why organized crime exists in the United States, the state allows it to exist because capitalism is real organized crime. And that's all the average member of organized crime wants to do is become legitimate. You watch The Godfather, that was true. You know what I mean? Particularly Godfather 2 and 3 and all that. They want to be legit because that's basically what the corporations are. You know what I mean? They can kill you and they're a person. They got all kinds of rights under the 14th Amendment. At the same time, they don't go to jail for anything. You hear me? So in applying Black Power today, I want to say a few things and then I'll wrap up. I put forward an analysis. If you go back and look at previous shows, the analysis is that since 68, changes have occurred in the Black community because of powerful hostile forces that hit us in the form of deindustrialization, drugs in the Black community, redevelopment agencies, and now gentrification, breaking up Black communities, and a host of other forces. COINTELPRO, killing off leaders. They came after me 3 times, came after my job. I've told you before, I could have beat them on it. The Spirit told me not to fight. That's the only time the Spirit told me not, and I didn't. And 3 years later, I'm teaching at San Francisco State, and they come after me again. The only one that they tried to deny tenure. But I've never lost a battle. And with the help of Nathan, Asa Hilliard, and my community, I won that battle. And I know they didn't like it. They came after us again to wipe us out. We beat them again. You know what I mean? You got a sense of power, know how to organize it, fine. So what happens in the post-1968 period, and King is assassinated in 1968, change occurs in the Black community. And we're facing those changes now where Black families are fragmented. Extended family communities extremely weak. The institutions that used to have real influence on Black people, like the Black church, have less influence. We have a generation gap where even though a sector of Black youth have resolved these issues, a large sector have not, where there's a disrespect towards elders and some elders towards youth. And so we have to adapt strategies and tactics that will enable us to rebuild our communities. I'm not going to go into this in detail. This is something that I'm going to be devoting a lot of shows to, but it's going to be done in a different way because this is stuff that people have to be willing to act on. So people are just here to listen. I don't have time to waste on this. So it's going to have to be some people who are engaged in the community, who are doing community organizing, that have demonstrated some skills, that want to come together and begin to do assessment and look at where our community's at, how we can rebuild. But I make these overall comments. One, because the forces that have hit us, and I've said this before, if you read my book, Integration Trap, Generation Gap Caused by Choice Between Two Cultures, God gave me this. These are not my words. The forces that have hit us have put us in a position of choosing between two cultures unconsciously, sometimes consciously, but often unconsciously. What does that mean? It means that for the first time in our people's history, the forces that have disrupted our people's lives have put us in a position of choosing between African American culture and Euro-American culture. And if you don't even know you have a culture, then you don't even know what the choices are you're making. You do have one, but often we don't know how to identify it. And so you can be in a position where you think you don't have a culture. You're not conscious of exactly what all these forces are that are hitting you that represent Western culture forces. You certainly know that drugs is. But when you have the intrusion of corporate values that are basically values that place a dollar over human life, you should know that that is not your culture, because African and African American culture places God first and human life right next to it. And there's no amount of money that you can put up that will equal the value of a human life. Yet the common saying among youth, of too many youth in the Black community, is, I'm not afraid to die, I'm afraid to live. And you see these rising suicide rates. So what I'm saying is, anything we do in the Black community is going to have culture at its core, African and African American. And we have largely neglected the study of African American culture. And these movements were successful. The Willie Ricks move was an expression of one of the key features of African American culture, which is creativity, spontaneous organization. It was more spontaneous than organized, but it spurred a lot of organization done on the spot, as the slave narrative said, on the spur of the moment. We're good at that. And that's a weapon we should use combined with planning. So one of the overall things I want to leave you with is this. We need to treat our communities as part of a nation. And we need to start looking at community rebuilding as nation building. And one of the most important features next to culture and nation building is economics. And we need to treat economic development as serious business. And we have some young people who are out there organizing that are quite good at economic development. I work with some of them, but there are a lot out there that I don't know anything about. And so we need to be networking. And when I do anything that I want to share, I want to bring in a lot of people who are doing community organizing and are doing some new organizing and have some opening into how to do economic development, along with others who have been organizing for a while. And we need to do systematic short-term and long-term planning in community rebuilding in general, but in economic development in general. And if you look at the nations of the world, the few that are doing progress, they do that. And by this point, America doesn't do that. They are not systematic in their economic planning because it's largely corporate run. And so they're out to block most things that are good for people. Look at Biden's infrastructure plan, the bigger one. Things like child credit, for people who have child care issues, money that will enable them to take care of that. Block that. You know what I mean? You got people going to bed hungry, not enough food to eat. And these are a large percentage of Black and red people, especially, And so if you want to change that, you've got to plan for that. That's not something that is going to happen at the goodwill of the federal government. And the changes that you want at the federal level, like guaranteed annual income, those are things that you also have to fight for. And those are short term, those are reformist, that's not revolutionary. But the key point is we have to begin to build bases of economic power in our community as we fight for good jobs for our people. So there's a lot more we have to do. The final thing I'd say about power is this. Every culture has its ethic of power. The European ethic of power is it's amoral. They don't have any kind of values that they attach to their sense of power. You've got to understand that. Their notion of power is arbitrary. And so whether it's corporate power, military power, political power, they do whatever they want to do. They may say because it's in their interest. But it doesn't have any ethics associated with it. African people historically have generally associated power with ethics, ma'at, harmony, truth, justice, right order. Speak truth, do truth. And so our warriors have generally had ethos and ethic of power, and we should keep it. But at the same time, we need to understand that we're going up against the powerful who have no ethics whatsoever in anything that they do. And if we descend to their level, then there's no point in exercising power because we'll be doing the same thing to our people that they've been doing to us. And some of us are doing that now. So in concluding this discussion on Black Power, the 60s and Black Power, lessons for building Black Power today. Black Power starts with you. It starts with you empowering yourself. To love yourself is an act of power. To know yourself is the basis for self-love. To respect yourself is what you have when you know and love yourself. There is respect. You can't have love without respect, and it starts with self-respect. So if we're going to build power in our community, rebuild it, then it starts with us rebuilding ourselves. And so I hope you got something out of this. 60s and Black Power today. The main focus here was on 60s and Black Power. So I hope you got something out of this. I see a lot of comments, a lot of statements, and we'll see what questions come up out of this. People have been telling me, keep doing this. This is some hard work. So I would hope, number one, everyone that watches this show, hit the subscription, subscribe. Go out and recruit your friends to subscribe. I do not believe I'm getting the correct count from these folks, but help me out. That's it. Hotel. So we'll go to the comments. Let's see. Brother here asked a question. Quadro Dieterville, can someone please remind me of the name of the university that Dr. Obenga founded in the Congo? I don't remember the name. It's named after the president of the University of the Congo. So if you go to the show where I interviewed Dr. Obenga and you watch the first part, we have the news clip when that university was set up, and the name of the university is there. Let's see. Lao Tzu, question. Dr. Jashaka, liberation is a matter of cultural shift. It's a part of it, yeah, because automatically, if you're dealing with power, the power that you're going to be expressing is going to be expressed through your culture if you're grounded, and oftentimes unconsciously. So when King said he wasn't trained to wield power, he was telling the truth, but the fact is his culture had trained him in some methods of wielding power, because he preceded that statement by saying that they had been successful in being creative in the South, and they came up with methods that work. And what were those methods? Improvisation. And then when you improvise something and it worked, it working that, so that's how they found that. So when you're grounded in your culture, you are going to approach things that way. And that's the way Black people are anyway. We have to do change constantly. So cultural shift is a part of it, but it's a lot more than culture. It's economic, it's political, it's social. You can say all of it's economic. I mean, all of it's cultural, but there are more dimensions than just culture. Stephen McKenzie, Dr. Jashaka, what would you say was the main reason for SF-CORE success? How did you all deal with low-intensity counterinsurgency from the white power structure? There was no one main reason, but reasons. We went to the people and found out what they wanted. We then oriented our objectives to what the people wanted. And I should say most of the people were not in our organization. We had a membership of 100, but we had a movement of 10,000. We were larger than the whole Black Panther Party, but as a movement, not as an organization, because these were groups and people coming from different groups. And I would say our success wasn't due to the size of the movement either. So one is we identified the issue that was key. And we didn't make the mistake, once I became chair, of dealing with a whole bunch of issues. And that was part of King's mistake in Chicago. He was dealing with housing, he was dealing with education, he was dealing with employment, he was dealing with That isn't why they were successful in the Southern movement. They'd come up on the issue that people wanted and a method for achieving that particular issue, that outcome. And that was the vote and desegregation. So you can't spread yourself too thin. So that was one reason. The other is we were a team. And so we used the skills of different people appropriately. Dengani, I was talking about him. I dedicated the show to him. He was chair of the education committee. Very quiet, reserved person. Whatever he said, you better listen to it because it was very perceptive. Norman Brown, who woke me up, community organizer. And Norman knows more people than anybody. You know what I mean? Norman, to this day, and multi-skilled, you know, in all kinds of things that he could do. Kermit Scott, who was my vice chair, who originally was going to run for chair, but when I ran, stepped aside. He was at least 10 years older than me, was a social worker, and was one of the best political campaign organizers in the country. He was the principal, but not sole organizer of Ron Dellum's successful campaign for the House of Representatives. Now, there were others that played a role in that campaign, and he gave me good advice. And so I listened, you know, that was part of it, but he brought that skill set in. Will Ussery, who was chair before me, who's about 10 years older than me, and looks the same as he looked in the 60s. He's a draftsman, and he had a skill in terms of laying things out sequentially. So when it came time to organize a total community, we're the only movement that did that. The Panthers didn't, and they were advised to by Jim Foreman, the 10-10 method, block by block organizing. I put him in charge. Why? Because he wasn't no good for a battle, because you can't be sequential in a battle. And by the way, chess does not prepare you for a battle. Chess has rules. Battles have no rules. And the best thing is, you have to read your opponent. But Will was good for sequential stuff. So the block organizing, he did it. I've got the actual thing he laid out. I could take this, my study's 400 feet. You could take and lay out that whole diagram for the block organizing that he laid out. 45,000 Black people. Only place in the country done that. And by the way, if you want to counter low intensity COINTELPRO, that's the best way, So we had a team of people, and that was key. The other thing is we had a strategist. And I'm going to tell you something. If you have a movement that doesn't have a strategist, you are in trouble. Malcolm was no strategist, neither was King. Malcolm's human rights strategy was correct, but it got him killed. Part of what got him killed. There were other things that got him killed. But that is one that set the international forces against him. We lost the maximum leader of the Black liberation movement at that time over a strategy that, had it succeeded, would have got minimal results. It would have embarrassed the United Nations, the United States before some world bodies that it controlled, like the UN. So you were not going to get any denunciation of the United States from the Security Council because the US set that thing up and it had veto power. And you're charging human rights violations, but the US has not signed on to the Human Rights Charter. So technically, getting them to denounce the US is going to be a difficult thing because of their power and because they're not a part of that. So strategy is the ultimate thing. That's my gift, strategy. And you can't train a person that doesn't have the skill. You have to have it, a natural affinity for that. It's as hard to define as love. In fact, I say strategy is the ultimate art, third to God and love. Next to God and love, it's the highest art. And when it's appropriately expressed, it is the most beautiful of arts because it's an aesthetic art. And so when you see groups get mauled over and everything else, well, maybe in some cases it's unavoidable. But if Cabral could go up against the Portuguese and lose 2,500 and the Portuguese losing 50,000, and that's an armed struggle, That's because he was a good strategist and he was also a good human being. He valued human life and he had rules. Don't kill women, don't kill children, don't kill the elders. Toussaint Louverture had the same rules. Some of us may think, well, being brutal and savage is a good thing. Well, you know, I, you know, the objective is winning, but with your humanity intact. You know, so I would say that the fact that we had appropriate strategy, and that's what enabled us to achieve victory. Um, Another reason was we formed alliances and coalitions when they were necessary to achieve a particular objective. Nationalists are always good at saying, we're alone. You're alone if you make yourself alone. We're in the strategic position in the US of triggering chain reaction. So when we make a move, other people make moves. The Young Lords followed the Black Panther Party, Puerto Rican organization. You know, the Panthers were not conscious of the fact that when we do things, other people do it. Maybe they became conscious after they started doing it. But the fact of the matter is, that's the nature of your power. We're the leading group in this country for social changes. We move, other groups move. Make sure you make the right move so other groups are not following you in the wrong direction. You know what I mean? So alliances and coalitions. An alliance is a permanent arrangement, a long-term arrangement with group. A coalition is short-term. You often don't know when you enter a coalition, sometimes whether it be long-term or short-term. In other cases, you do because you have a limited objective in forming them. You only form those when you can't win on your own. And then the rule is you control them when you form them. You should read my book, The Art of Leadership, Volume 1. Volume 2 is out of print. That came out of experience, So that was another reason. There were a whole lot of others. I'd say one of the biggest is we buried our egos. There were times where I could lead something and Will Ussery could, but we figured somebody else was better, not because they were better at it. They were the better person for that. You hear me? And we had no disagreements with any of the major Black freedom movement organizations. And it's a common view, and it was true in many cases. A lot of groups falling out with each other. You understand? And that often starts with the egos of the leaders. So bury your ego. And I have one. It's under control. You hear me? It's under control. So there was not any single one thing. It was a whole bunch of things. LaShonda C. Henderson. How can the people turn the tide when errors are made by leadership? What's the best way to support the leader in the crowd to move to the center? I've said this before. We're now in a period where we don't need single leaders. It's horse and buggy stuff now. The Kings, the Malcolms, they were good for their period. But now we have multiple problems. They're extremely complex. And if we're going to address those multiple problems, you need multiple leadership. The model that Ella Baker had of group-centered leadership, which we used when it came to decision-making, we weren't following her, but it was consensus decision-making. That model comes out of the hunter-gatherer societies, where everybody had a say-so in it. There was no singular leader, and decision was by consensus. And that becomes the basis for African democracy. That's in us. Jazz is based on that principle. The African American art form is based on, that's what improvisation is. We're democratic at core. You know what I mean? We don't like people over us telling us what to do. So if you look at how Black Lives Matter organized their stuff, a bunch of networks coming together. And it's very, very hard for the government to handle. So that's the way I think you handle it. The other question also had something on low intensity. We didn't face low intensity in 65 because it didn't exist. COINTELPRO was only coming into being then. I faced COINTELPRO in low intensity operations since then. And I've told you, I think, a couple of weeks ago that the way I geared myself up for that was reading General Kitson's book, Low Intensity and Peacekeeping Operations, written by a British general who had defeated the Mau Mau's in Kenya and the Malaysian independence movement and had worked against the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, but didn't defeat them. And so when you have someone write a book like that who's a master, you can talk about how bad he is, he's good at what he does, then that framework is probably going to be successful. Ronald Reagan adopted that and adapted it to the US as governor of California and then brought it into the White House. So I faced that. And I wouldn't be alive but for the fact that I had trained myself in this, because in low intensity operations, you have to see what's happening before it happens, because that's why it's low intensity. It's hidden. And, they're going to move on you in ways that you won't, the community won't know what hit it, because they're going to make it look like it came from somewhere else. So there's a whole process in this. At some point, I'd like to be doing training with other people who have skills, young people, and people who have longevity in the movement, have been effective in this, but it's going to be around objectives. And we have to get people who are involved in community organizing now, Loud to Zoo. Dr. DeShaka, can you provide a few references to the consensus process used by SNCC? Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement by a sister named Ramsby. Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement. That's a good one. And anything on SNCC would be a good reference for that. Brother Agawa, who had to check out, I want to thank him for the work he's doing to build this show. He made a comment. Baba Amos Wilson used to say black on black violence, if it could be called that, killed their own because they hadn't been taught to kill their true enemy. Your story seems to confirm this. Yeah, except I didn't have much discussion on us killing each other. But that usually isn't movement action unless the egos are involved. Hayward McCullough, a black woman on the SCOTUS does not equal black power. I don't trust no black people from South Carolina. Well, actually, you should. And I'm not saying them, but South Carolina is where we're the most African. No, I mean, the Supreme Court is certainly not an institution of black power. It is, in fact, an institution of white power in the extreme. And it has gained a lot of its power at the expense of the Constitution. It's taken away the power of the Congress in many cases and weakened the power of the presidency. Okay, Brother Osiah P.A.P.O, thanks for your comments here. And Brother Quadro Didaville, he said, I share your shows every week on social media and greatly appreciative of your historical perspective. Thank you, brother. Loud to Zoos encouraging people to sign up. Okay, that looks like it's it. So I've enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of it. Share it. And I'll see you next week.